If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Then you need to hit the little bell to get updates. We'll keep them coming. Thank you very much. Welcome to another journey through the winding, often shadowed paths of justice, or sometimes it's dramatic failures. Here on the New Jersey Criminal Podcast. Today, we're not just leafing through old history books. We're holding a bit of a seance, conjuring the ghostly echoes of a trial that once gripped a nation. The Lindbergh kidnapping, the trial of Bruno Hauptmann. It's a story that still casts a long, unsettling shadow on how we understand what due process truly means. We begin not at the trial's outset, but near its chilling conclusion, with a peek into a December day in 1935, weeks before a man was scheduled to face the electric chair. From a New York Times article dated December 24th, 1935, we read, "A clemency petition, the last desperate gasp. Hauptmann, there in his death row cell, putting his name to documents that might grant him a stay. Perhaps a lifetime behind bars instead of the chair. A stark human moment caught in amber, you can picture it. We've all seen that movie. But this isn't just a historical recap. This is an open letter, a message from 2025 directed at the very foundation of this prosecution. It's a critique, actually. A sharp one, hopefully, asking how exactly what unfolded in Flemington, New Jersey could ever be seen as anything but an outrageous, ethically bankrupt charade by any measure today. Chapter 1, The Ghost of Flemington, a Modern Indictment. Dear Justice itself and the whispers of 1935. From our perch in 2025, where the core tenets of due process, prosecutorial ethics, and forensic science have been painstakingly carved into our legal bedrock, the Lindbergh kidnapping trial of Bruno Hauptmann looks less like a quest for truth. It feels more like a staged drama with a bewildered defendant trapped on a rigged set. It's a stark reminder that justice's scales can sometimes be weighted not only by evidence, but by the clamor of the crowd and the ambition of those who wield the law. Let's speak plainly about the most egregious, the truly indefensible parts of that prosecution. Parts that wouldn't just raise an eyebrow today, but would blow the very courtroom apart, leaving behind a scene of legal chaos and ethical condemnation. An unholy bargain when the prosecutor forgot his oath. Let's start with that unholy bargain. Between the prosecutor and the grieving icon. Picture this: David Wilentz, New Jersey's Attorney General, working hand in glove with Charles Lindbergh, the child's father, a star witness, and a figure of immense national power. In a modern court, such a setup is simply unthinkable. This isn't just a simple conflict of interest, it's a deep corrosive corruption of a prosecutor's sacred duty. And in 1935, perhaps those lines blurred. Overwhelming wave of public anguish and heartbreak. But today, a prosecutor doesn't champion a single family, no matter how famous. Certainly not under this kind of spotlight. Ghislaine Maxwell and the Maxwell and Epstein franchise excluded, of course. It's their job to seek impartial justice for all the people of the state, not just the rich ones, not the famous ones. And Lindbergh at the time, boy, he might have been the hero. Imagine like the first guy to walk on the moon or dunk a basketball or come up with something that's just awesome. That's how big he was. He was Michael Jackson in 1986. He was the man. Lindbergh's closeness to the evidence, His profound grief, his unparalleled celebrity, all of it would today unleash a torrent of ethical alarm, shaking the Flemington courthouse to its foundation. Imagine it, the main victim witness strategizing with the prosecution, perhaps even shaping the story the state would tell. This isn't just a minor issue, it's a systemic poison from the jump. The man told the state police not to look in his neighbor's yard, said there was no point, so they didn't. Are you kidding me? You can see our Meg Horner's interview with Judge Lisa Perlman and she's the author of the book, Lindbergh Kidnapping Suspect Number 1, The Man Who Got Away. You know, modern courts demand a solid, impenetrable wall between the prosecution and its witnesses, especially when those witnesses hold such a clear stake in the outcome. The U.S. Supreme Court in Berger versus the United States decided the very year of Hauptmann's trial, it spelled out this essential truth, that a prosecutor acts not of an ordinary party, but of a sovereignty whose obligation to govern impartially is as compelling as the obligation to govern at all. Their goal isn't just to win, but that justice shall be done. Wilentz's collaboration with Lindbergh stands in stark, defiant opposition to this core tenet. Today, such a partnership would immediately disqualify the prosecutor. The lawyers involved could face disbarment proceedings under the ABA model rules of professional conduct, rules that demand impartiality and forbid actions that disgrace the profession. And for Bruno Hauptmann, the defendant, it would almost certainly have led to a mistrial or even a dismissal of charges. His Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial would be clearly violated. The image of a famous grieving parent, especially embedded within the prosecution, wouldn't be seen as a search for truth. It would look like an inexcusable manipulation of public sentiment to get a conviction, regardless of the ethical cost, and it would be a legal farce. Played out for an audience that was, by the way, already convinced of guilt before a single piece of evidence hit the courtroom floor. Courtroom table, courtroom witness stand, wherever they were putting the evidence. And our justice system is a delicate thing. When its most powerful figures, prosecutors, let their neutrality be swayed by the pull of celebrity or raw emotion, the whole structure threatens to crumble. And that whole case is sort of fruit of the poison tree. The seeds of absurdity in Flemington were sown irrevocably in that unholy bargain between these two men. Even in the final desperate moments of Hauptmann's appeals, we get glimpses of this strange, compromised legal landscape. The same New York Times article reports about Hauptmann's clemency plea. One departure from routine was regarded as possible, however, in view of Governor Hoffman's previously expressed desire that the members of the court hear Hauptmann's story from the condemned man in prison. Should the court accede to this desire, its session might be held at the state prison, probably in the office of the warden. Governor Hoffmann paid a personal visit to Hauptmann's cell and talked with the convicted man, later urging other members of the court to do likewise. Governor Hoffmann's personal involvement, his visit to Hauptmann's cell, his push for clemency, courting court members to do the same, these actions might have been born of genuine concern, but they reveal another blurring of lines that a modern system would find deeply troubling. The state's highest executive personally engaging with a prisoner sentenced to death and trying to influence a judicial review suggests a level of outside pressure and informal contact that, by today's ethical benchmarks, would at minimum demand scrutiny. A highly visible intervention from a politically powerful figure in a judicial process should raise alarms about due process and the independence of our courts. From science, quote unquote, to smoke and mirrors. The evidence was shaky. No pun intended. We're going to be talking about a ladder. Next, we face the ghost of falsified evidence and the shaky science that propped up the prosecution's case. In the unforgiving light of a modern courtroom, evidence gets forensic scrutiny that would make the 1935, quote, science, unquote, of the Hauptmann trial look like ancient voodoo magic kooky. The crucial pieces of evidence, the testimony linking a scrap of wood from Hauptmann's attic to the infamous kidnapping ladder, or the hotly debated handwriting analysis connecting him to the ransom notes, all would be ripped apart with an intensity we couldn't have dreamed of back then. Again, those 2 points both covered in Lindbergh kidnapping suspect number 1 and in Meg Horner's interview with Judge Lise Perlman, that's Lise Perlman, who is the author of the aforementioned book. Consider the prosecution's star physical evidence, the famous ladder and wood expert Arthur Kohler's testimony. His identification of a single piece of wood, supposedly from Hauptmann's attic, based on tool marks and grain patterns, felt revolutionary at the time. Today, that'd get shredded like cheap paper in a hurricane. Modern courts, or as an example in New Jersey, use the Daubert standard for expert testimony, set by Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. You check out the Mighty Merp podcast. She did a whole thing on Daubert last season. This standard demands that scientific evidence rely on solid methods, be thoroughly tested, peer-reviewed, and widely accepted by the scientific community. Kohler's observations, while detailed, were largely subjective. Modern defense would call in their own forensic wood experts, microscopes, chemical tests, statistical probabilities to challenge the very basis and reliability of such a definitive match. And the chances of that testimony holding up under Daubert's gaze without major qualifications or even being thrown out entirely are slim to none. It speaks to the raw, underdeveloped state of forensic science then, and it's a damning indictment of their certainty at the time, especially by today's standards. And the parade of handwriting experts. The prosecution brought in several whose opinions weren't always in perfect harmony even at the same time, and they told a couple of them in advance whose handwriting it was, like what the results were supposed to be. That doesn't play even back then. These experts would face a barrage of questions about their training, the scientific backing for their conclusions, and the risk of confirmation bias. The sheer number of conflicting experts would likely render much of that testimony unreliable, chipping away at the core pillar of the state's argument. Beyond the science, there's a deeper ethical problem. Active falsification, or just hiding exculpatory evidence, is a huge problem. Now, the Brady rule, established in Brady v. Maryland, decades after Hauptmann, makes it necessary and mandatory for the prosecution to share any evidence favorable to the accused, anything that might show innocence or reduce punishment. Later investigations and legal scholars have strongly suggested that exculpatory evidence, like other possible suspects, different handwriting analysis, or doubts about witness credibility, was suppressed or ignored. If Brady had been in effect, any deliberate withholding of such important evidence would instantly overturn the conviction. It could even lead to criminal charges against those responsible under Nepew v. Illinois for knowingly using false testimony. The integrity of evidence isn't just a legal nicety, it's the lifeblood of a fair trial. To tamper with it, to present shaky voodoo science as absolute fact, or to bury inconvenient truths, see Karen Reed, is to poison the wellspring of justice itself. And the Hauptmann prosecution, seen through that modern lens, looks less like a careful assembly of facts and more like a cherry-picked collection designed to fit a chosen story. An approach utterly absurd today in the day of true crime and the internet and the interest for justice amongst the public. It seems like a risky gamble. Again, see the Karen Reed trial. It's within that tangled web of questionable evidence and potential suppression that Hauptmann's clemency petition becomes even more revealing. The same New York Times article notes, and I quote, although the contents of the petition were not divulged in accordance with the practice of the court, it was indicated that Hauptmann's attorneys would seek modification of the death sentence on the ground of new evidence, among others. The petition did not set the evidence forth in detail, but new evidence, among others. This phrase, even in 35, tells us the defense attorneys felt there were critical pieces missing or misunderstood from the original trial, period. The fact that the petition kept it vague was either a strategic move or that general rules at the time for the court. But for us in 2025, it highlights the very weakness we're dissecting. A modern court facing credible claims of new evidence, especially evidence that might have been hidden or just overlooked in the first trial, would be forced to re-examine the original conviction with unprecedented rigor. They might even grant a new trial, not just consider a lighter sentence. The sheer absurdity of the prosecution is amplified by the very real chance that the full truth or mitigating factors never once saw the light of day. Now, the media frenzy and the ghost of impartiality. Let's talk about the very air of the trial, a genuine media carnival, a three-ring circus under Justice's big top. Public opinion had well in advance damned Bruno Hauptmann long before the jury ever heard opening arguments, much less closing statements. In a modern setting, such an atmosphere would trigger swift, decisive action from the judge. It wouldn't be allowed to fester like a infection. The Lindbergh kidnapping trial, and the Lindbergh kidnapping as the crime of the century, and the trial as the trial of the century, the media frenzy was unlike anything seen before. Like I said, this guy was Michael Jackson. Newspapers screamed headlines daily, radio reports captivated a nation, and the hunger for a culprit for swift vengeance was insatiable. Let me take that back. He was O.J. Simpson. So Flemington becomes a chaotic pilgrimage site for reporters, photographers, and onlookers. The relentless, pervasive, sensationalized reporting created an inescapable echo chamber of guilt. In 1935, since we've got another one coming up, the legal tools to tamp down that type of influence were crude, almost non-existent. Today, judges wield a powerful arsenal and hopefully a will to ensure fairness. Under the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees an impartial jury, and the 14th Amendment's pledge of due process, modern courts are equipped to fight off such damaging publicity. The landmark Supreme Court case, Shepard v. Maxwell, decided much later, but directly shaped by the abuses of high-profile trials like Hauptmann's, outlined clear duties for judges, which include change of venue, moving the trial to a different place where public feelings are less inflamed, making it possible to pick an unbiased jury. Jury sequestration. Having a spell. Jury sequestration. Keeping the jury entirely cut off from outside influences, newspapers, television, social media for the whole trial. The Hauptmann jury wasn't kept sequestered for most of the trial, sending them home daily to a world certain of the defendant's guilt. Gag orders that restrict what lawyers, witnesses, and even police can say publicly about the case, silencing the constant drumbeat of speculation and accusation. Strict control over the courtroom itself, limiting press access, managing courtroom behavior to stop it from becoming a spectacle. None of these vital safeguards were fully used or even consistently considered in 1935. The courtroom itself was pure chaos, a free-for-all where the line between news and entertainment vanished. Sound familiar? The jury was immersed in a community convinced of his guilt, bombarded daily by the dominant narrative. We've got, without question, a modern judge faced with that same emotionally charged, predetermined environment where the very air was thick with calls for vengeance would almost certainly order a change of venue without hesitation. And the very idea that a defendant could get a fair trial under these conditions is, by any contemporary measure, an insult to justice and just anybody's intelligence. It's outrageous. The roar of the crowd swallowed the quiet whisper of due process entirely. Remarkably, even in 1935, on the edge of his execution, the defense was still fighting this narrative. The New York Times adds more detail. I begin with, there is also a possibility that the court may be asked to view a part of the motion picture taken at the trial of Hauptmann and Flemington. The governor has the films. It was said at his office, but it was not made clear whether he or defense counsel contended that the trial was held in a circus atmosphere. Even then, the defense was saying exactly what Shepard v. Maxwell would later confirm. The mere existence of trial footage and the defense's wish to use it to show the circus atmosphere is a testament to the existence of a chaotic bias setting. A modern court would need old film reels to grasp that a trial described as a circus flies in the face of due process. It highlights just how deeply and blatantly the public spectacle had overshadowed the quest for justice, the solemn quest for justice that at least Wilentz is on the hook for in this process. The unseen threads, other stories, other suspects. Let's peel the curtain back a little further on the sheer absurdity of the Hauptmann prosecution. Let's look at the shadows it deliberately chose to ignore. On past episodes of this podcast, we've been lucky enough to speak with authors whose deep research has really ripped at the original verdict and the process. They've shown, if not an exact solution to what happened, for sure tunnel vision that defined the prosecution. And former guest legal scholar Judge Lisa Pearlman, author of Lindbergh Kidnapping Suspect Number 1, and investigative author Robert Zorn, with his gripping book Cemetery John, have both, from different angles entirely, picked apart the foundation of the Hauptmann prosecution. Even as dueling pianos, so to speak, with conflicting conclusions of their own, they're in full agreement that the prosecution was preposterous. They've looked at how the hunt for justice got twisted, perhaps by intense pressure, and clearly, regardless of where the evidence pointed. Judge Lisa Pearlman's book brings insight. She's a retired California administrative law judge. Her entire argument, laid out in Lindbergh Kidnapping Suspect Number 1, suggests that perhaps Violet Sharp, made connected to the Lindbergh social circle, was potentially involved or an accomplice and had information and a myriad of other details down to the ladder construction and evidence that was found, 5 weeks after the case in the road by the Lindbergh property. It's just preposterous. Pearlman argues the authorities, caught in the moment's pressure, Lindbergh's influence, just zeroed in on Hauptmann and never let go, ignoring or dismissing credible leads all along the way. Not a small mistake. And it demonstrates how a modern criminal investigation must chase down every credible lead, if only to avoid public scrutiny and criticism down the road. Again, see Karen Reed. Imagine the outrage today if viable alternative suspects. This really is Karen Reed. These paragraphs match up perfectly. I wrote it when I wasn't quite truly awake, but the outrage today was Karen Reed. Viable alternative suspects having circumstantial ties minimum brushed aside for a single-minded pursuit, screaming of confirmation bias, facts bent to fit the theory rather than the theory emerging from the facts. Yeah, we know how people would react. We just saw it. And beyond that, Judge Perlman's work questions how ironclad the evidence against Hauptmann truly was. If Sharp was involved, then the wood, the handwriting, the ransom money, all the pillars of the prosecution need a total relook. In a modern court, the defense would jump on alternative explanations. They would force the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hauptmann was the sole perpetrator, not just a possible, especially when other strong theories like Judge Perlman's are on the table. And I lean to Judge Perlman's over author Robert Zorn's. That's just me. Read them both yourself or listen to those interviews. They're both great. The original prosecution's failure to properly explore any other past makes their case against Hauptmann by modern light look dangerously incomplete. And like I said, ripe for criticism, if nothing else. Appearances matter in justice. Now, Robert Zorn, whose book is deeply personal, it's an investigation. It's called Cemetery John. It names his father as a witness to gathering information that counters the narrative of the official prosecution story. Again, prosecution, and these are theories that existed at the time, but the prosecution didn't look at this either, the Cemetery John story or the Cemetery John connection. Or even if there was for sure a real guy being Cemetery John behind the scenes and not just a contrived character by maybe Lindbergh. A modern thorough investigation would painstakingly follow every lead, at least to the point where they wouldn't be called into obvious question. And the failure to even properly vet credible alternative suspects and just a feverish rush to close like the biggest, most important case in conversation and trial of the era is just the exact opposite of what you expect. Zorn's narrative talks a lot about how the ransom money was handled, old certificates found on Hauptmann. If, as Zorn suggests, others were involved, it also raises questions about how the money spread out and why the trail seemed to lead only and decisively to Hauptmann. But then again, according to the prosecution, every trail led to Hauptmann. A modern forensic investigation would trace much more effectively the movements of that ransom money. And once more, we come back to Lindbergh's central and ethically questionable role in the ransom negotiation. That his influence could potentially steer, limit the investigation feels beyond outrageous for a modern court striving for anything appearing like unbiased justice. Both Perlman and Zorn, both Judge Perlman and Robert Zorn, I keep feeling like a jerk when I just belt out Perlman. Like I know Judge Lisa Perlman so well that, hey, Perlman, need another beer from the fridge? No, it's Judge Perlman. Forgive me. So Judge Perlman and Zorn, if, their work, even though conflicting, reveal how fragile the prosecution's version of the case was when you strip away the emotional firestorm surrounding it. They both have compelling alternative looks and perspectives, and clearly in a modern courtroom, the state's version would be utterly pummeled. The original prosecution's failure to properly explore, acknowledge any significant narratives, evidence is inadequate on its face. So the ethical lapses, the shortcuts, the undeniable rush and pressure, right up until Hauptmann's final desperate plea, which continues that article in, what's the New York Times say here? So he's under sentence to die in the electric chair during the week of January 13. There's imminence of the date set for the execution. So Justice cared, again, less about the exhaustive scrutiny and more about the relentless march on the calendar, even in the case of Hauptmann's own execution. A condemned man on just rails headed towards his fate, belting out letters, and the shadow of the electric chair and our justice system by today's bright lights, super sketchy looking right now. The rush after this conclusion is just as sketchy as the conclusion itself. If there's a hair of doubt that there was shenanigans, I'm the one with that Juris Doctorate on this channel. But if there's a hair of evidence that there's shenanigans, what's the rush? I mean, we're talking like 18 days from Hauptmann's letter. So in conclusion, this is Flemington's unforgettable warning. We'll close this letter to the past, as it were, this message from 2025. The way the Hauptmann prosecution was managed, handled, strategized in Flemington, New Jersey, wouldn't just be considered outrageous today. It would be considered a legal and ethical disaster of unimaginable scale. We're talking Attorney General, New Jersey State Police, just making a fool of themselves at the behest of an extremely powerful man on the national scene. We've got a prosecutor's unholy alliance with a key witness / should always be a suspect. For God's sake, everybody in the building should have been a suspect until they weren't, much less leading the investigation, but I digress. Falsifying evidence, out-of-control media, all this converging into a circus environment where a fair trial was, simply put, not happening. Not minor slips. These are attacks on the very pillars of justice by comparison. Things we now hold sacred like fairness, scientific rigor, transparency, and the right to an unbiased hearing. And we now seem more willing to hold those accountable when it comes to light. Again, Google Karen Reed if you have no idea what I'm talking about. And if you're a rabbit hole type, see you in a couple months, because that stuff was bananas. But very much neglecting to look at alternative suspects and theories that scream plausibility. From the Berger decision that defines a prosecutor's sacred duty, to Daubert's gatekeeping for scientific evidence, to Brady's mandate for sharing all relevant facts, Shepard's insistence on controlling damaging publicity, and our legal landscape has evolved. The work of Judge Lisa Pearlman and Robert Zorn shines a wonderful light on the profound investigative tunnel vision that plagued the original case. They have valid alternative theories that were left in the dark, leading to what many now believe was a monumental failure, bastardization, perversion of justice. The Bruno Hauptmann trial stands as an indelible, indefensible, stark, and powerful warning. It's etched into the very stone of our legal history in New Jersey and the nation. It reminds us that justice, to be true, must be blind not only to power and prestige, but to the roar of the crowd. It is a constant ghostly whisper that demands eternal vigilance against any force that would bend the arc of justice towards quick results rather than the unwavering, relentless, meticulous pursuit of truth in detail. We've come a long way since that trial of that century. building better safeguards and ethical walls against these abuses. The ghost of cases like Hauptmann's remain. To beat a dead horse, Karen Reed is a horrifying modern example. So if that can happen in the internet age, this needs to be and remain a relentless quest that can't rest on old victories or flawed foundations. People are fallible or potentially evil, compromised, sociopathic. Join us next time on the New Jersey Criminal Podcast as we continue to unearth stories that shape our New Jersey crime history, the consequences, the evolution, the quest for justice. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, stay limber, and we'll see you soon. Oh, wait, source index. I mentioned a bunch of stuff that I don't generally know off the top of my head. Berger versus U.S., 1935. For the Minister of Justice standard for prosecutors, the ABA model rules of professional conduct. Rule 3.8, special responsibilities of a prosecutor. Albert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, the standard of admissibility of expert scientific testimony in federal courts in many states, including New Jersey. Brady v. Maryland, the Brady rule. That's a famous one. Everybody knows that one. You don't even have to be a fan of the sport to know the Brady rule. Nepew versus Illinois, which I'm just guessing I've said wrong 3 times in that instance, now being the third. Reference for the prohibition against a prosecutor's knowing use of false testimony. Then there's Shepard v. Maxwell, reference for judicial responsibilities and controlling prejudicial publicity. Lisa Pearlman Lindbergh, kidnapping suspect number 1, Union Square Press. Robert Zorn, Cemetery John, the undiscovered story of the Lindbergh kidnapping, Overlook Press. Hauptmann signs clemency plea, bid to pardons court for life term expected on Monday. That's the New York Times, December 1935. That was the contemporary account I drew from Hauptmann's clemency efforts at the wire after the trial of the century, or the circus of the century. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Then you need to hit the little bell to get updates. We'll keep them coming. Thank you very much. See you soon.